Welcome back to Psychology Applied to Work. This is lecture 14, Finding Talent. All right, lecture 13 was on chapter 5, as this lecture will be as well. If you recall, our lecture 13 was nice and short because chapter 5 is short, and I suspect that this lecture also will be nice and short. Our last lecture, we talked about hiring decisions, selection processes. We talked about selection and things like cutoff scores. We talked about the determination of selection criteria and selection ratios, as well as cutoff scores. We talked about hiring and employment and the law, and employment decisions and the federal laws that are applicable. And we talked about some of the court-determined legal exceptions to the legal construct of a protected class. And we talked about the legal theories of discrimination. Today, lecture 14 is on finding talent or recruitment. How do you recruit? How do you go about and find and bring these people in that you want to select from and find the best candidate to hire? So after we introduce the concept of recruitment, we'll talk about what do we mean by the most qualified. Talk about the labor market and what it is and how it should affect your recruitment strategy. Along those lines, we'll talk about how do you cast your nets for recruiting talent, and we'll talk about how do you scale and augment your recruiting efforts with external partners, and we will talk about what employers can do to try to make them become sort of destination employers, employers of choice that might make their recruiting more effective or easier. All right, let's get into this. What do we mean by recruiting? And a lot of the art that I've picked for this lecture is from old Army recruiting posters. Not in all cases. The rest of the stuff is the AI-generated art I've been using throughout the class. All right, so what we're talking about here is searching, finding, and in some cases luring, because in some cases you know exactly the talent you want. You might know their name and where they work. Well, how do you entice them? How do you coax them to consider coming and working for your organization? In other cases, you don't know who the people are, and so how do you go about searching for them? How do you find them? So certainly at one point or another, you're going to make eye contact. You're going to make contact, and the basics apply here. If when you want to recruit, you're in a sales mode. You're selling your organization. So, if you get in face to face, you smile, you nod, you make eye contact, you answer all the questions. You do the kinds of things that you'd expect to do if you're trying to make a good impression. So this is kind of reverse interviewing in a way, where you're trying to present your organization as the place that the candidate or the person you're trying to recruit should want to work at. So, like I talked about in interviewing, a lot of times these things are reciprocal, and there are times in which the employer sort of has the advantage, and there's definitely times in which the candidate can have the advantage, depending upon the labor market, depending on the particular employee, depending on the needs of the employer. All right, so one good method for recruitment, once you've made some kind of contact and you're talking to somebody about your organization and specifically the role you're trying to recruit them for, is called a realistic job preview. And that's where you talk about the job in straightforward terms, both positive and potentially negative aspects of the job. The job involves a lot of travel. If the job involves standing up for several hours or whatever, what are the positive and the negative, and to not sugarcoat the negative, because that's actually correlated with subsequent job satisfaction. People trust you more when you talk about the job realistically. So having your organization being perceived as honest actually makes you, that trust factor actually will help when you're recruiting, and it will also help with subsequently how people feel. You don't want to have a situation where you're being recruited and this potential employer is talking about how awesome it is, and then you get there and it's not so awesome. Well, you kind of felt like you got cheated, and it's going to make it more likely that you will leave as soon as you get the next opportunity. But if your first encounter with an organization is built upon trust, that's a nice foundation to grow your trust and to then make a commitment yourself to that organization. So this should be pretty common sense. All right, what do we mean by the most qualified? Obviously, we're talking about trying to find the best employees. And for your organization, for your position, you really want to define what that means. And that's that whole job analysis. That's the whole KSAOs. What is it about, that's the critical incidents. I mean, the things we've been talking about how you define a job and how you determine the best tests in order to search for the best candidate. All of those inform, what you mean by the most qualified, and should be clear to you by now that you want to be objective and to define that, and you derive that, first and foremost from your job analysis. But you should also recognize that you seldom find the perfect candidate. That the various candidates you might find, they often have different strengths and different gaps, and so. In an ideal world, the best candidate not only emerges well above the pack through your assessment and interviewing, but that candidate also checks every box you've got and is really the perfect candidate in all ways. That just almost never happens. Usually you're picking from a group of people that each can be looked at as being the strongest in one particular dimension and the weakest in another, and you're trying to develop a assessment method and a scoring system and a selection process that can try to make that as objective as possible. But you should definitely recognize that these are people, and it's impossible to make it 100% objective. And if you take the view that you're making sort of trade-off decisions and trying to find who is most qualified, and recognizing that there'll be dimensions that a person scores lower in and dimensions that they score higher in, and you're trying to kind of make a weighted decision. And that whole process is not always easy. So you're trying to predict the future, right? Life is always trying to live in the future, and you're trying to project based upon what limited information you have about a candidate, how well they will do. If you've done it enough and had some decisions end up being really good and some decisions that you look back on and think, boy, we really hired the wrong person, it gives you pause when you're at that decision point for a new candidate. It's a difficult process, and throughout as much effort as you make to make it objective, that might sort of ease some of the mental burden, because you've done the best you can. You've created an objective system, and the best person's going to be the one that scores the most across like a panel of people doing the interview after you go through a series of assessments. Okay, but that you're really just trying to reduce your odds of a mistake and trying to improve your odds of a really great candidate. But in the end, you don't really know, isn't it? Because you really can't. You really can't define like what is the total qualities of this person, based upon some assessment tests and some interviews. So these are difficult things. Do your best to use objective methods, use multiple selection criteria, use several trained people in the decision process. Maximize wisdom of the crowd of people who have a vested interest in making a good selection, that will live with the consequences of their decision. Look for multiple ways of weighting things, view it as a trade-off, and do the best you can. Make sure your recruitment process is valid. Make sure that whatever you're doing to try to find people, that you're actually looking for the right type of people. That's the kind of people you want, that have the right experience and are there to properly weave into your organization. And there are business and legal ramifications if you make an error there. Certainly business ramifications if you don't have if you're not recruiting in a way that makes sense. You're not going to get the people that you hope to get. And then, of course, if you end up with violating the 80% rule that we talked about in the last lecture, there can certainly be legal and liability consequences of a invalid recruitment process. All right, let's talk about the labor market. Labor markets. This is basically the supply and demand, if you will. The scarcity or lack thereof. The scarcity or glut of qualified people. And of course, it really depends on what do we mean by qualified and where. In your area for your organization, you need a certain type of experience and people with a certain subset of KSAOs. How available are they? And there's a lot of them available, and they're all desperate for work. Well, you're going to be able to have a pick of the litter, so to speak, and you won't have to pay a lot. So you'll have inexpensive and well available labor, and in which case you're sort of in a buyer's market, or in this case a employer's market. But these things ebb and flow, and like right now there are certainly labor markets that are tight, in which case it's a sort of a seller's market. It's an employee's market, and wages rise, and it's harder and harder to find those people. So labor markets matter to your decision making, to how hard you're going to work with recruitment. So the scarcity and gluts. As an example, as I record this in 2022, a number of service industries, transport, nursing, and a lot of technology fields, labor is very tight. Post-COVID, the service industry has yet to recover from where we were pre-COVID. There are a great shortage of truck drivers, of service workers. The healthcare shortages continue to get worse, generally speaking, and then people in the STEM fields, and not to mention trade organizations, mechanics and contractors and that sort of thing. So there's a number of markets where labor is tight. As an example, this past summer, I don't know what it is right now, but when I searched Amazon's website for their available jobs, and specifically just looking for like salaried software jobs. This isn't jobs in their fulfillment centers and that sort of thing, in which case this number could be quite a bit different. These are salaried software professionals, and at the time there were 30,000 positions they were looking to fill. There's hospitals in our region that are working hard to sponsor visas to bring in hundreds of nurses from overseas, because they just simply can't get enough of them domestically. Academic labor is kind of a glut, so the other side of it. So what do we mean? Well, in that same time period when Amazon had 30,000 open salaried professionals, there were at the time I looked only 8 positions at NDSU that were professor positions, and each one of those positions was a very, very unique position, a very narrow set of skills required, and all of those would be highly competitive, with lots and lots of applicants from all over the country looking for that. So universities have found lower cost options with adjunct instructors like myself. Because there's simply too many PhDs chasing too many openings. My situation's a little unique. I'm teaching this class more because I want to. But there is a tiered labor structure because of that glut, and there's a lot of arguably very overqualified people, teaching university classes for not a lot of compensation, and the number of tenure track academic positions is very small for the number of qualified people. So just giving you a couple examples of where labor is really tight and where there is a glut of supply. So if you have a situation where finding candidates is hard, that means recruitment is hard. It also means that what you pay people, and it isn't, recall in the Why We Work lecture, it isn't just dollars, it's benefits and it's other things. But you need to look at the resources and rewards that you provide your employees, and you will probably have to increase that if you cannot find the candidates that you want. And the cost of that is not simply for the candidates that you're hiring, because if you have to pay people more to bring them in the door, the people that already work for you will go, hey, how come this person right out of school or whatever, who doesn't know anything about what we're doing, and I'm training this person, how come they make more than me? So if you want to retain, so retention, and we're going to talk about retention in our next lecture, but if you want to retain your talent, and you're in a tight labor market, you usually have to increase the reward for the people that are working there, as well as increase what you're offering people to come and work for you. So this basic concept of supply and demand should be something you guys are familiar with, and know that these things ebb and flow over time. Some cases they can last for decades, where you just have a chronic structural deficit of certain types of skills because people just don't want to do that work, or whatever, or it's just really, really hard to accumulate those skills. But other times you get where these things are seasonal, they fluctuate, and like COVID had weird, whipsaw-like effects of supply and demand in the labor markets, because all of a sudden, demand for certain things just dried up when everybody, at the very early stages, everybody stayed home, and the demand for like Uber Eats and other things and to-go food skyrocketed, but demand for a lot of other things, went down, and then it flipped back the other way. And some of those places are service industry. Some of them were for consumer goods and that sort of thing. And so those factories saw all sorts of demand fluctuation. So anyway, these things have sort of weather patterns that can last, months or years, and it really it's a supply and demand situation. All right, so what do you do when you're recruiting? How do you determine how hard you work, and how can you cast your nets wide? And the wider you cast them, the more people you're going to get, but the more work you got to do to sift through those people, and the more resources it's going to take to do that fishing, so to speak. So some of the things to look at is to find the best candidate. You obviously want the broadest possible diverse applicant pool. Again, the more people you look at, the more work you have to do to try to find the best one. In that sorting and filtering process, that burns your time, that burns your resources. Although sometimes you can have online software that sort of automates like the first pass, and you can pre-sort to get the people that are clearly unqualified. They don't have the requisite experience, and because they stated that in like an online form, you can eliminate them from possibility, save yourself a little bit of time. And then, but entry-level people, for people right out of school, it's difficult to differentiate. You have what's their degree and what's their GPA, and what did they do in school, and did they do an internship in terms of college positions and that sort of thing. But it's actually can be challenging to really know what you're looking at when somebody hasn't had any real experience. In which case, if you cast your net wide there, you can be inundated with lots and lots of entry-level candidates for your position, and you really have no idea you have limited idea of who's really the most qualified, and so you end up having to do cutoffs that sometimes are almost arbitrarily high. Like you do a super high GPA cutoff, and that there probably isn't really good data that says that a 3.7 is better than a 3.65. But if you don't do something like that, you just can't handle the sheer amount of applicants. So there's practical decisions here. And so often in a organization you have human resources or perhaps in external recruiting partners that handle that first layer of filtering to determine who at least appears qualified on paper, so to speak, and those then get sent to the hiring manager to figure out who's the most qualified for interviews. So that's usually what happens, is the person that will be ultimately this individual's managers, in most cases, is the one making the sort of the final cut, and separating the qualified from the highly qualified, so that you can do the interviews to figure out the most qualified. Another thing with how hard you have to work with recruitment, and we'll talk about this a little bit in the last slide, is are you when you are recruiting and you're encountering people and you tell them who you are, I mean, to what extent does your organization have a known brand? And I don't mean necessarily that this is a brand like Chevrolet or Kraft, because in some cases you might be the U.S. government, or you might be a nonprofit organization, but there's an awareness of what that organization is. Well, there might be other cases. You might work for somebody that the people who you are recruiting have no idea who you are. So if they know who you are, now you have that as part of your calculus. That you have that as in terms of what you got to think through, and hopefully, the impression that people have of your organization's brand, so to speak, is positive. But that isn't always the case either. And the ideal situation is that you work for an organization that people know that not only that it exists, but that they think it's a great organization. They think it's a great organization to work for. In which case, the more you have that going for you, the less hard you have to work on recruiting. The less nets you have to put out there. The less wide you have to cast them, because in that case, people often will come to you. So organizations, there's this term employer of choice, and we'll talk about that a little bit in the last slide. And it's quite common for an organization to try to become the employer of choice in their area, of the people of the other organizations that are like them. You want to be the one that people would want to work for the most. Now achieving that, I mean, there's a zero-sum element to it, sort of, in that. If somebody is the most sought after, if one organization is the most sought after, that's usually at the detriment of other organizations. So easier said than done. But there are things that an organization can do that's under their control, and there's things that aren't as under their control. But this concept of employer of choice is something you might encounter. So a poor reputation, if your organization's brand or your organization's reputation is bad, that people think that's that those people fire people easily, or they're losing their market share, or I've heard that's a really tough place to work, or that's in a lousy location, that can hurt your ability to attract talent. And this should be pretty common sense, I would hope. All right, so when you're doing recruiting, oftentimes you're not doing it alone. You're often partnering with people, and in some cases those people are happy to partner with you as long as you pay for them. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So there's recruiting firms, and they often have extensive networks, and they're basically connectors. They're trying to build databases. They're trying to have people that know people in various places, and they can ask around, and they can directly contact other potential candidates where you as your organization, you're trying to find a certain skilled professional with a certain kind of experience for your position. There are recruiting firms that, for the money, will find you people. Often, if you yourself find yourself having developed highly marketable skills, you might find yourself to be a regular target of recruiters. That's sort of a badge that you're in a good market. If you get emails and otherwise reach outs from recruiters who want to know who you are and want to know more about your experience because they want to line you up with another employer that might pay you more or have other benefits for you. So the way recruiting firms often get paid is sort of success based. Not always, but often what a recruiter will get a certain amount a certain amount of compensation can be built in, where it's like, okay, if you find me a good candidate, you're going to get X% of the on top. I'm going to pay that candidate, and that candidate's going to work for me, but I'm going to pay you X% of what I pay that candidate for a certain amount of time or whatever. And there's fixed fees. There's all sorts of ways of doing it. And recruiters can even do things where you can go to sort of a recruiter to try to find an employer for you, and you can make a deal sort of backwards, where if they find you a good employer, and if that employer hires you, is you pay that recruiter a certain amount of your paycheck for a certain amount of time. So it's the service goes both ways in many cases. There's obviously websites, which are the modern help wanted ads, and that used to be in the back of newspapers, and that's sort of the modern advertising platform. Employers, employees add employers. So within employers, there's usually the best source of referrals, which that bullet point's not written very well, but internal referrals are often the best, because you have somebody internally that's sort of vouching for that person. So that's it's quite common for some organizations to offer referral bonuses internally for people that will tell their employer of a good candidate. Which there's the bullet for that. Okay. Then there's job fairs, career fairs, and you might have even experienced some of them at the university. And it's a good way to meet a number of potential candidates, and it's a good way for candidates to meet a number of potential employers. And it's also a place you'll often find recruiters. So that how hard an organization works to sell themselves at a job fair is usually directly correlated to how tight that labor market is. And then obviously there's social networking and social media in today's age that has to be factored in. And LinkedIn is a very powerful social networking site for recruiting. At many levels, where it's often advantageous for managers. Like I myself, as a manager at a Fortune 100 organization, it's in my best interest to have as broad of a network attached to my LinkedIn profile as I can, and then in times in which I'm hiring, I might want to actually post that and say, hey, I'm looking for somebody that's a senior staff engineer qualified for these sorts of things, and then I'm acting as my own recruiter in that regard. And these social networking sites, and LinkedIn in particular, have become powerful tools to let people do that. There's been actually some studies that that social media is obviously a double-edged sword, and there's certainly people that have put stuff on social media that might embarrass them, or otherwise make them think that they're not going to get selected because of what they put when they're teens or their early 20s or whatever. And just deleting it all isn't necessarily going to help you, because some studies have shown that there are some companies that if you have zero social media presence, that's a red flag that you probably did. You probably had stuff that you needed to get rid of. All right, so trying to be the employer of choice. These are some it's really high level stuff of what organizations can do. This itself could be, this is a huge deal. This is one of those, $1 trillion problems. In terms of how do you, as an organization, become the, number one sought after thing. So, I mean, one thing to give you some background, Elon Musk, he will often, he's quite active in Twitter, and he's quite a showman, and he often has these what seem to be product showcase unveilings, for Tesla and for SpaceX or the Boring Company or Neuralink, and he gets a great deal of press. If you watch them, they appear to be all about him talking about what the Cybertruck is going to be like, or what Starship's going to be like, or what have you, and that there are ways to update the public about the state of the technology and the products at those companies. And you think, oh, well, I wonder what that's for. Is it so people buy more Teslas, or is it so that people feel better about the stock? And yes, but the probably number one reason he does that, and does that so often and so well, is to maintain Tesla and SpaceX's status as employers of choice, because he is trying to attract the best of the best. And Elon Musk's companies have a reputation for places where you have to work really, really hard. And Elon Musk seems to lean into that reputation because he wants people that really want to 100% commit to green technology, or to make the human race multiplanetary and those sorts of things. And he wants the brightest and hardest working people. And so he does these big public relations events to talk about how awesome their technology is, to get people to be excited and nerd out about it. In fact, I'm actually wearing a SpaceX t-shirt that has a Tesla Roadster on it, because he sent one of his cars out to Mars orbit, which is ridiculous. Why would he do something like that? Well, it's insanely cool. And if you are a young engineer and you're really bright, and you have a lot of options, you went to got great grades, and you really think that you could have your pick of employers, well, Tesla or SpaceX might be where you want to work, because of how much effort Elon Musk and those companies have done to market themselves as the employer of choice. Now, not everybody gets to be a Tesla or SpaceX, and not everybody has those resources or is riding a success wave in that regard. But every organization can benefit from trying to adopt some of the best practices to become more of a sought after destination, so to speak. So some basic things here, treat your people right, because it depends on how local it is, but the organizations develop reputations, and especially if you're recruiting within like one city or region area, you generally encounter candidates who know somebody, or know somebody who knows somebody that works at the organization. And so what those people say about what it's like working for you, working for your organization, has a huge factor. So treat your people right, so they say good things, and be that organization. Don't be the organization that does the great things, and be the organization that treats your people well. If you can, be the organization that pays the most. It's easy to say, right? You can always pay your people more if you don't actually need to make a profit or need to actually stay in business. So these things are not singular, and these things come at a cost. But if you can't pay the people the most, somebody else is paying them the most. If you can't treat people the best, somebody is treating them the best. And you're not likely to be the employer of choice. There's a rub to all of these things. Obviously, providing the most benefits. If you can't afford to be the place that gives the best pay, that gives the best benefits, that gives the most time off, if you're not the company that's working on the coolest, best products, it doesn't mean you don't have options to try to be the employer of choice, but you also have to understand that it's kind of like recruiting for big sports teams in colleges. Is those people that have the most options, usually look for the best, and so it's you're competing against other organizations for the best talent. And there is virtuous cycles and vicious cycles in this. The reciprocality in that, which is if you attract really good talent, your organization does well, people say good things about you, you attract more, even more good talent, and these things can augment each other. If you can't afford good people, and you end up with having to lower your cutoff scores, so to speak, and hire people that you wish you didn't have to, but it's the best you can find, and end up in like Mediocristan, which is a fictitious country of mediocre people that some people have used that term. Oftentimes that might result in you not doing so well as an organization and then not getting a good reputation. So that becomes kind of a vicious circle, and kicking yourself out of that, doing something to get yourself onto a success track can be quite hard. But if you know these things and know these things are at play, it can help inform some of your decisions to try to vector in the right direction anyway. So obviously some of these things that are reward resource-wise come at a cost. But there's things you can do that aren't as expensive. There are places that'll basically say there's a pop machine with a bunch of caffeinated soda, and they just put it there for free. Software companies will often do that. Little tiny perks that maybe they're not so good for people's long-term health, cavities, diabetes, that sort of thing. But not everything is really expensive. That can still make a difference in how people feel about the place. You definitely want your overall word-of-mouth narratives to be as positive as you can be. Whoever's talking about you, obviously your employers, your employees, but also your suppliers, your customers. The people that come in to clean the windows. People gossip, and they gossip about organizations. Just like they gossip about people. So what are your narratives that people are using when they're talking about your organization? To your interns, you don't don't just make the interns do the most boring, tedious stuff because your salaried people don't want to. You got to look at your interns, your part-time students, as people that are going to go back to that school, and they are all for sure going to talk about what their experience was over summer at their internship or whatever. And if they go, yeah, it's it sucked, and I was doing all this grunt work, or half the time they didn't have anything for me to do. Nobody seemed very motivated there. I mean, those things definitely have an effect on whether you're going to get the best talent. So all of these things matter. So you try to get the best public relations that you can, and definitely don't get bad PR. And this isn't just interns complaining. This is like when your organization does something that gets in the press for malfeasance or something else. So to become the employer of choice is really about maximizing the positive narrative that the world has about you. All right. So that was 38 minutes, another short lecture. Chapter 5 is a nice short chapter. These are important topics, but they're pretty straightforward. And our next lectures should also be a little shorter as well. So today we talked about finding talent. We talked about what do we mean by the most qualified. We talked about labor markets and scarcities and gluts. We talked about how to size your nets and what factors make recruiting more or less difficult. We talked about the way you can leverage external partners and things like LinkedIn for your recruiting efforts. And then we talked about what it means to try to be the employer of choice. So next lecture, lecture 15, will be the bonus lecture, and that's talking about retention. So we have hiring, we have recruiting, and we have retention. So how do you find the people? How do you make the hiring decision? And then how do you keep the people? And keeping people is like one of those things that often doesn't get the attention it really needs until it's a problem, until you've suddenly had a number of key people leave. and then all of a sudden you realize, oh crap, I got a retention problem, and the cost to fix that once it's a problem often exceeds what it could have cost you to prevent it in the first place. But kind of a human nature thing. So how do you keep talent? It starts with making first impressions. You can also have formal and informal programs within your organization directly targeting retention. And then there's internal surveys where you're trying to get a feel, a pulse of how your employees are feeling and doing, what level of commitment and trust do they have in the organization. And then when you do lose people, in some cases there are retirements and that sort of thing, but often it's like, hey, I'm going to go work for a competitor. When they're heading out the door, oftentimes they're more honest. Not always, but oftentimes more honest than they are when they're still working there, because they don't want to upset people. So using exit interviews as a source of closer to unvarnished truth to help you with feedback to how to improve your organization can be beneficial. All right, that is the end of lecture 14, and we will see you for lecture 15.